Our last 10,000 years: agriculture, population, biology. This is the end of the story, in a sense, of biological anthropology. And it is, in some ways, the least interesting. To historians, it's the most interesting. To biological anthropologists, well, maybe some of them find it much more interesting. But here's a point where the biological modifications of our species has pretty much come to a close. Now Homo sapiens are the dominant apex predator on the planet. We're the only hominins left. All the other ones have gone extinct. Even Neanderthal and Denisovan and all the other folks we shared the planet with for a while in the last 200,000 years. But now, due to the advent of agriculture, the Green Revolution, we're seeing that adaptations and modifications to our species, is still occurring. The biggest ones are, I think, around the face shape and the teeth, in that, well, not the teeth as much. Teeth are more genetically governed, whereas the shape of our head and the shape of our mouth specifically has been more adaptive. So our mouth shape has shrunk and due to our diet softening, and but genetically we still, the point is, like wisdom teeth, we still have these teeth that are a vestigial appendage of the old days when we were hunter-gatherers, and maybe we did need them, because we are chewing a lot more tough stuff occasionally. But the other adaptations that we're dealing with, because of our dietary changes, is things like bad health sort of things. Okay. So in the last 10,000 years, all of us were, I think the book says, 99.8% of our history, 99.8% of our species history, for the last, let's say, 200,000 years, has been as hunter-gatherers. Right? Has been not eating domesticated food or animals, eating wild food and wild animals. So only in the last 10,000 years at most, because even then, at 10,000 years, some people were domesticating plants and animals, but still, there were other places around the planet that people were still very much hunter-gatherers. But all humans around the world were, again, eating this wide variety of food. And the wide variety is healthier, frankly, like the paleo diet. This transition of the Pleistocene and Holocene was generally called the Neolithic, which is the Stone Age. All right, lithic is stone, and so Neo, it's like the new Stone Age or something. Human began to this whole domestication thing, around this time, and like and it's at varying points. The earliest ones might have been 10 to 12,000 years ago, and there are other things that are domesticated as more recently, as 2 or 3,000 years ago. So this did have a profound effect on Homo sapien biology, and so it's not to say that it hasn't, but what it has not had effect on is the Darwinian, selective pressures, to the extent that we're still Homo sapiens. We're Homo sapiens that most likely, most would argue, have been, conceived and bred and best adapted for life on the equator in East Africa, around the old Vai Gorge. That's most likely where Homo sapiens evolved from, and then, went all around the planet. So that's what we're adapted for, and then we went all over the planet, and now we're eating all these domesticated foods. That's kind of the big shift. So biologically, our species is undergoing change, but that's the point. It is our species. Whereas for the previous chapters of what we've mainly been discussing is speciation. That selective pressures have basically taken species out, and selected for allele frequencies, adaptations or whatever, that will give them a better advantage. We don't see that happening, in the last 10,000 years. That is a very short time anyway for speciation to occur. So we have deliberately, been choosing specific, plants and animals over others. And that's resulted in this accidental domestication and then intentional eventually. So the bad or good is when a certain type of food is very fecund or frequent. The problem related to that is that we start relying on it to the exclusion of other foods. The worst case scenario that I can think of is the potato famine of 1847 in Ireland. Potatoes are a great food source. They provide minerals, protein, and very good. And if you mix it with a few greens, it's a good, healthy diet, but starches as well. But the Irish peasant was utterly reliant on one species of potato. So all throughout the west of Ireland, that's all they were growing. It was easy to grow. It provided a lot of food, tasted good. But then due to this, what you call monocropping, due to this heavy reliance on one species, the obvious accident happened in 1847, where a disease came through that killed that species of potato. And it was a blight that kind of pushed through the country very rapidly. And so ostensibly overnight, the peasantry of an entire country went from having more than enough food to having almost no food. And it became the potato famine. It resulted in, many Irish dying, a rapid depopulation, of the island, which is still, underpopulated based on pre-potato famine population statistics relative to the present. And but it also, motivated a major departure from the country, which is why, like, my grandparents left Ireland and came to America, right? And many others. That was more in the 1900s, but it started all in that era where life in Ireland was becoming untenable because of monocrop, because of their own choices, sadly. So this is the point, of point 3 that I'm mentioning. You're becoming too heavily reliant on certain things is going to bring about its own problems, such as sedentary living, so now you're not moving around as much. Crowded living, meaning you're going to be in a lot closer quarters with other humans who have diseases, who have, and can spread them to you. And infectious diseases, and zoological as well as human. So, the common cold is not really a problem of our species. It's a problem of how we live together in close quarters. The flu shot you always get, it's right before winter, because winter is when we're all sitting inside of buildings with each other, breathing on each other in close quarters. If you remember the discussion about carrying capacity, several chapters ago, these sorts of diseases don't happen in the wild because, a pride of lions might be, a circumference of, 50 or 100 miles. No, that would be that group of lions. That's enough food for them. That's, so if they have some disease within them and it spreads throughout the entire pride, it might kill off that entire pride, and it doesn't spread to other groups of lions in this case. And so this increase of infectious diseases, living very close to other humans, living very close to animals, becomes a huge problem, causing more health problems, new health problems. Yeah, so I mean that's the challenge. One other issue is, why did we start growing our food after hunting and gathering? I mean, why did we do that? If you can kind of ask that more as a theoretical question, it's an interesting question. Um, so, like I said, one of the biggest influences that the rise of agriculture has done to our species from a biological standpoint can be seen in our mouths. There's a funny joke here in the top left. Relax, Billy. These are just braces. Even I had them, and when I was your age, the dentist is saying that, even though it doesn't look like he actually had braces. The use of braces is not because modern humans are narcissistic and want to look pretty, and we have this arbitrary, I mean, part of it might be this arbitrary definition of pretty, which is straight white teeth. I mean, that's some of it, maybe, vanity. But another important part of braces is the biological responses to the change in diet. Which we can see in these images below that can bring about certain things. Our mouths have gotten smaller as a result of, and the musculature, of the jaw has gotten smaller because our diet has become much softer in the advent of agriculture. The genes that control our teeth and how many rows of teeth we have and all that sort of thing, 3, 1, 2, 3, and all that. That is controlled more by genetics and not by epigenetics, and as a consequence, it hasn't changed, and so many people need their wisdom teeth removed. And another thing that happens is this overbite. We can see in the bottom right image an underbite. In fact, one of my sons, I have 5 sons, one of them has this a rather pronounced prognosis or whatever, underbite. And you can see it on his jawline. His jaw sticks out further. And I've seen it in his aunt as well. He looks a lot like his aunt. And then I finally figured out why. They have the same jawline in a sense, and they have both the same. I'm not sure if she ever got braces to correct that, to bring it more in. But my son will be getting that. Okay, the questions that will be addressed in this chapter, kind of our objectives, is to better understand when, where, and why did agriculture first develop? How did agriculture affect human living circumstances? How did agriculture affect human biological change? What are the most important forces shaping the human biology today? And finally, are we still evolving? And that kind of is the question, like always in the back of our head. Are we still evolving? What could we evolve into? At variety of levels. Like I said, there's this whole different epigenetic level or slight modifications versus actual allele frequency shifts and stuff. Okay. The Green Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, as it has been referred to, is the big story in a sense of today. If you see on the timelines in the textbook, the lowercase y, uppercase B, uppercase P is years before the present. That's basically the timeline we're using now. Prior to this, we've been using million years ago. But now we're using years before the present, and they're doing that specifically because of the confusion of, Anno Domini, right? Before the Common Era or before Christ, BC, AD, however you want to call it, before the Common Era. So instead of saying, 2000 BC, which is like, okay, that means 2000 plus another 2000. Okay, so it's 4,000 years ago, right? All the numbers are just in years ago, which frankly, in my opinion, is far simpler. So we see on this little chart here, the evolution of food production in plants for about the last 15,000 years. Is the time scale. Now, the book typically refers to this event, the Green Revolution, as 10,000 years ago. And even with that, there's a standard deviation, of, well, I don't know, standard deviation. It's because some will say 12,000 years ago. Some will say 12,000 years ago. Some will say 10,000 years ago. And then the next thing connected to that is the rise of hyper civilizations. That still is not going to be happening for another 5,000 years approximately. So it's not like we're seeing big state level societies, the Aztec Empire or the Nile River Delta. But it's true that in places where agriculture domestication first happened, this is probably where we're going to see the first big civilizations happening. But again, 5,000 years later in most cases. So this is the rise of agriculture, not the rise of civilization or state level society, stuff like that. Which is, sorry, it's not to say that we're still hunter-gatherers. We're moving, we're increasing our population. We're moving from hunter-gatherers to more complex assemblages of people and trying to figure out how to do that. Organizing a lot of people in one small space is very complicated, not just for the social fights, but real problems. Like, where does all the poop go? If you 500 people who are living in one valley that used to include just one group of hunter-gatherers, you really gotta, is there enough water for everybody? Okay, there is, but is everybody pooping in that water source? So, anyway, serious big problems. So what we see on this table is from 15,000 years ago, food production from wild plants. We're still pretty much 15,000 years ago foraging. We're definitely using fire. We've been using fire since, Homo erectus. So yeah, fire, we've mastered. Hunting, with very good tools, we've totally mastered, right? But what we're ending up doing is our dependence on wild plants and wild food is on the decline. Even 15,000 years ago, you can imagine people going to the same place year after year. Let's say if they live, we can say in this very valley, the San Joaquin Valley, the indigenous peoples might have, archaeological evidence would suggest this, they summered up in the foothills, maybe around Mariposa, and stuff like that. This is an archaeological site I'm familiar with, I dug at. So maybe they're summering up in the foothills because it's a lot cooler. And there are food sources up there, nuts in the trees and, some hunting and stuff like that. But then in the winter, when it's colder up there, they move back down into the valley. And so they'll be eating food sources that are down here. If you go to the same place year after year, imagine a bush of blueberries. I love blueberries. So let's just take that as an example. There's this, 5 or 6 blueberry bushes, whatever, that you find somewhere, down here in the valley. And it's really tasty. So you're coming down to the valley, you got to live somewhere. These blueberries are here. You just set camp there, and then you end up persisting there, for the entire winter, let's say. And maybe it was originally because, it's by a water source and there's some hunting opportunities here and other food sources, but it was mainly those blueberries. They were really tasty. So you and your people are consuming the blueberries in this particular geographic location, and you're also living there. Okay, and an important thing that people do when they live, they eat, they reproduce, and they poop. Or respire, like all living things, breathe in and out. Well, our out breathing in that sense is pooping. So you're pooping out blueberry seeds amongst other things. So, you come down next winter, and there's more blueberry bushes. You come down, 10 generations later, and there's a serious investment of blueberry bushes in this whole area right here, and so natural domestication, of wild plants and animals, you can imagine, and this is just out of my imagination, how did the first domestication events occur? That would technically not be called domestication. That is technically how Darwinian natural selection works. Flowers are pretty, or they smell nice, or they provide. And I mean, they smell nice because they have something nice to eat, nectar. All right, that is very attractive to birds or bees who can either see bright colors or they can smell sweet smells. And they go to those things and eat those things. Bees, let's say, for example, they go to the flowers and they get the nectar. While they're doing that, the bee rubs off some of its sperm, basically, so that it can go to the next flower and have the sperm kind of spread over the eggs on the next flower. So that's sex, and they're using bees to do it. Birds are heavily reliant on the fruit of trees. A nice apple is pretty and it's sweet, but most importantly, there are seeds in its core, so that the bird will eat the seeds, fly far away, and poop the seeds out. So there you have natural selection, plants relying on animals to do the heavy lifting of their expansion. So in that sense, how often have plants been using humans, for them to spread their own, genetic information? That's an interesting thing I like to ponder, actually. But anyway, let's go. So 11,000 years, 11 to 9, we see this beginning of food production, of wild, dominant plants. Incipient farming, this is what I'm kind of getting at, with small scale clearance of vegetation. Horticulturalists, they are still here. There's hunter-gatherers, there's horticulturalists, and then there's agriculturalists. And again, our society is not an agricultural society. We are in an industrial society. Even in the San Joaquin Valley, where agriculture dominates, it's agriculture being executed at an industrial level. So it's not an agricultural society. That you can imagine small farms with 1 cow and 5 chickens, that sort of thing. So this is all beginning during this era, from 11 to 6, and then more recently, that by 6,000 years ago, in some areas again on the planet, we see this crop, is dominating. Now they're confronting this whole problem of leaching all the nitrogen out of a certain field or whatever, and figuring out, hey, what's that about? We grew stuff here really well, for 10 years, and now it's not working anymore. So they're inventing fertilizer. It's missing something, and missing something that's inside the poop of some animals. So let's put that there. So, all this technological shift going on. So the general trend we're looking at is a decrease in the dependence of wild plants and animals, even though we're still, to this day, we occasionally will go hunt for a wild animal or eat some wild food, and an increase in plant domestication, right? That's the general trend. Sorry, that was a bigger picture. This is a little easier to see. Okay. The foods are interesting. If you ever saw, and I'm sure there's a museum somewhere in Mexico that'll illustrate this, because the Central America and in Mexico predominantly invented corn. It started there, and but it looked like we see on the image on the left here. It looked a lot like wheat. Like a piece of wheat where you just see these little kernels, little wheat kernels. I'm not sure if I have a picture of wheat somewhere. I don't really have one. But imagine wheat. And now imagine each kernel of wheat growing to the size of corn today. That would just be incredible. I don't know why that hasn't happened. But, well, actually, wheat looked a lot like grass. If you look at a piece of grass, you'll see those little things on the heads of the grass, the seeds or whatever. And that's what wheat has done. It shifted from grass to what wheat looks like. Corn has shifted from something that looked a lot more like wheat to what we recognize corn to be. Hence domestication. Hence, people successively picking a plant that has the best parts of it in terms of human diet, and not selecting for other features. So yeah, I had one nice video on here in terms of the climatological effects on agriculture. And that's often a question asked. Why, if we've been around for, some will say we've been around 400,000 years, And then others have suggested, yeah, maybe 400,000 to 200,000. That was one kind of species of Homo sapien, archaic Homo, maybe, but not really us. But it seems like we've been around for around 200,000 years. So why did it take us so long to figure out plant domestication? I mean, did our brains get smarter all of a sudden? Well, a better suggestion, I think, is climate. There might have been a climate shift depicted here that might have helped truly motivate this agricultural revolution. It's climate change in first domestication of plants and animals. You see, it's around 10 to 12,000 years ago, and you can see, I mean, you can link it like that in terms of a huge warming. This, let's say 100,000 years ago was the last interglacial event where everything was warm, and then glaciers started moving in and started getting cold again. This whole story has been about, right? It's been warm and wet in different periods. Ostensibly, weather on the equator has expanded and contracted, based on the coldness, of the poles expanding and contracting. So the last big one that we've suffered through, in a sense, was 100,000 years ago. And you can see this red squiggly line. It was warm, it got really cold, and it's been very up and down. From 25 to 12,000 years ago, this whole period, frankly, of and I didn't mention this yesterday, of up and down that we see during the last 50 or even 100,000 years is a real testament in one sense to Homo sapiens sapien, our species, that we were able to adapt to these sorts of things. It wouldn't be in anybody's lifetime, because we're talking thousands of years, that things get really cold and things get not so cold. Really bad winters versus, seasons. We have 4 seasons here. Let's say if you're living in France and you're a Neolithic hunter-gatherer. But the fact that we were able to adapt to this radical things, like every 15,000 years there's another apparently ice age in our region of where we live. That's the point, that maybe Denisovans, and other Neanderthal and all those sorts of guys could not adapt to that rapid, up and down, and we somehow were able to. Anyway, this huge increase in temperature right here, around 14,000 years ago, and then this huge dip right after it. This is what I have a really good video on that we'll be watching in a moment. That, in a sense, it would be jarring, and I would think it would have caused a lot of near extinction event type things potentially. But then we see, again, from 12,000 years ago, a general warming that hasn't stopped, and we're still up there, to this day. We haven't gone back down cold again, thankfully. Well, I mean, now everyone's worried about global warming. I mean, if you look at geological time, global warming is not really the enemy. The enemy is extreme cold winters that don't stop. But anyway, so part of this advent of an incredible warming, in the last 100,000 years, plus a sustained warming, and that might have done it. Mind you, it's not just humans who are trying to adapt and thrive and survive. Okay, keep in mind that we might be the pawns of the plants. I wrote a book chapter about that. This idea of, and I got the idea from this guy, a Berkeley journalist who's written about the expansion of plants and animals and that. But who's domesticating whom? Sometimes is the question. The planet could be dominated by trees and forests or by grasses. In a sense, interspersed woodland is an opportunity that a lot of climatic zones can deal with, but really grasses dominate the planet right now. There are a lot more spaces with huge grasslands, and grasslands include things like crops of wheat and crops of corn, or just crops of grasses that your cows and sheep and goats will eat. Those spaces predominate, and forests don't. And so if you think of like a chess match between the grasses versus the trees versus the grasses, there's like a battle. And of course, I'm making this as if these are thinking creatures, and they're not. This is adaptive radiation in a Darwinian sense. Grasses seem to be able to take more advantage of humans, because grasses, again, I'm showing you here, corn, wheat and other things. Grasses have more quickly adapted to the needs and desires of the dominant carrier, the dominant, locomotive animal on the planet who will carry their seeds and spread them. So just like birds, trees, make their fruit sweet so a bird will eat it and poop their seeds out somewhere else. Think about grasses doing that for humans. They've adapted to us so that we chop forests down and plant grasses or any type of grains, basically. So, so that's the other thing that's going on. We're not the only ones adapting. Everybody on the planet has saw this huge warming event. I mean, they did not see it in the Darwinian adaptive strategies at work here. All right. So the Fertile Crescent, this again is over and over referred to as, the birth of humanity. Some Old Testament Bible scholars will call it, this is where Adam and Eve were. If there was a Garden of Eden, this very much is it. It's absolutely a metaphorical Garden of Eden in terms of being an incredible breadbasket. Fertile Crescent, you can see in the left-hand screen here, it's roughly crescent shaped, right? If the Mediterranean Sea weren't here, it would look a lot more like a full crescent, right? But basically this whole land going from Egypt all the way to the Persian Gulf, over the Indian subcontinent, the Arabian Peninsula, that is a really, really fertile area. The soils are incredibly rich. Over and over, it's almost like you can just drop stuff on the ground and it'll grow. I mean, of course, it's not that simple, but you can see why agriculture, this would be one of the first places that agriculture could be domesticated, because accidental or unintentional domestication was more rapidly going on. My metaphor about the blueberry bushes, in here, it wouldn't maybe take a generation, of people. It wouldn't take 25 years. Maybe it'll take 2 years. And it's like, wow, look at all these more. Remember last year, there was 2 blueberry bushes. Now there's 15. I wonder how that happened. Yeah, that's where Uncle Bob used to poop all the time. Sorry. But anyway, we can see the different, the forest, subtropical woodlands, steppe grasslands. Again, these forested areas are going to eventually, humans are going to chop those trees down and replace them with grains. Just watch. And then you can ask yourself, again, who's controlling whom, but furthermore, we're seeing archaeological evidence of villages and cities are beginning to erupt in these same places. Turkey is a big, big actor in all of this. The country of Turkey, just in terms of a lot of animal domestication going on. It's a perfectly suited location in a variety of ways. So, that's the other thing. Once you have extra food, you can have extra people. And once you have extra people, you're going to have to manage those people. And it's the struggle of people management, I would put forth, that has motivated a lot of sociocultural evolution, because it goes down to, I mean, we've seen, there used to be a hydrological hypothesis that basically argued that civilization itself, state level society, not band, or tribe, or chiefdom, but state, band, tribe, chiefdom, state. Those are the classic 4 types of socio-political complexity that we find in societies cross-culturally. And it's state level society is the question. Where did it erupt? Where was it brought about? How? And all this. They used to say it was all in places where irrigation was happening. And basically the argument was, if you need to control water, and if you're up the irrigation canal, if I'm at the top of the canal and I control all the water, if I stop it and shift all the water to go into my fields, and I didn't tell the people down the road, down the canal or down the river or whatever it is, they're going to be extremely angry because they're dependent on that water too. So somehow being able to, organize things with the people who are closest to the water source and all the other people down the rest of the water source, if you can keep all those farmers happy, you basically are, you've got an MBA, a master's in business administration or something. Basically, you're at a state level society, because honestly, if I was a farmer down at the end, I would just go bananas. You've killed all my crops again. This is the third year in the row. I'm going to war. Why be a farmer? I'm going to be a soldier now. And even to this day, those sorts of issues are still contentious, between farmers. It's now more the farmers in the state are fighting it out rather than farmer to farmer. So anyway, managing big groups of people is the solution. State level side is the solution. But how did you get the big groups of people? Again, that was because of domestication of plants and animals. You just can have a lot more people. Like in my case, you can have 5 kids and they can all live, yay. But now you got to do something with them. Maybe 2 of them can be farmers, because those 2 farmers will feed all 5 of us. What do the other 3 kids do? I mean, that's the beauty of farming. It can produce so much wealth in terms of, the food. So not all 5 people would have to go hunting and gathering every day. Maybe only 2 of them have to do farming, and the other 3 could end up doing other things, right? So other plants and animal domestication. We see, China and Southeast Asia, that's where rice started. That was around 8,000 years ago. And I mean, to this day, if you think of rice, you often think of Asia, right? Asians really like rice. Well, it might not be like as much as that's what they're used to. Mexico is where corn was domesticated around 9,000 years ago. And again, the evidence, if we think about it, why is domestication going on at the same time all around the planet? Okay, with people who there's no way that they could have been connected to each other. South Asians and Mexicans, they independently were able to figure out plant domestication, which is another cause. You say, what is the cause? Well, the cause is not culture. It might be environmental, climatic. Right? Animal domestication similarly is going on independently, coevally, they call it, coevolution, so people are independently figuring these things out on their own. And again, the adaptive trade-off that I mentioned earlier, here's some more solid data on it. High birth rate, rapid weaning. Another problem with if you look at apes, chimpanzees or whatever, how long they wean. That's the other thing about agriculture. Agriculture can produce soft, sweet food. And the sooner you can produce soft, sweet food, the sooner you can feed that to your baby. And if you feed that to your baby, then you stop lactating. If you stop lactating, you're more likely to get pregnant. Not that lactation is an effective mode of birth control. It is not 100% certain, but it does decrease your likelihood of getting pregnant if you are breastfeeding. And so, like in the case of, again, the San Joaquin Valley here, if you take acorns and make it into a mush, which again, my colleague in archaeology has done that over and over with students, trying to illustrate how you would take, the mano and the daba, the hand rock, and there's depressions throughout up around the Mariposa area on these rock surfaces where indigenous people would gather, these acorns, mash them up, pick out all the coverings of the shells that had tannins on them that were very bitter, and take just the meat of those nuts, which is kind of yellowish, and mash it up further into a mash, and then put it in hot water, and you end up with a porridge, kind of like oatmeal. And the point about it is, it's very sweet. A baby will eat it, and because a baby just wants something warm, liquidy and sweet, and it's breast milk or porridge, and so this is the whole idea about this idea of high birth rate, rapid weaning are connected to each other. Um, we're talking population statistics. So when we talk about statistical likelihoods, you're less likely to get pregnant if you're weaning, if you're no longer breastfeeding. We're talking about that amongst 1 million people, and 500 years. So yes, then the statistics really bear out. And that's the point, this demographic transition. So populations blew up, one would argue, from 2 to 3 million 10,000 years ago to 300 million 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago, when at that level, that's society started very clearly all over the globe. 2,000 years ago, there were 300 million people. But how fast we went from 2 to 3 million to 300 million is significant, in a sense, in a matter of 8,000 years, and all because of this food thing, this agricultural revolution. All right, see, and the table is a nice illustration of it. Further data indicating these differences in terms of the effects of agriculture, good or bad. So one good, I guess you could say good, is a huge population explosion. And again, some people will complain about that. Oh no, there's too many people on the planet. I had a biology friend of mine kind of publicly shame me because I had too many children. I had 2 already, and my wife was pregnant. My new wife was pregnant with my 3rd child, her first, and he's shaming me about it. And it was just in a public area. It was at a biology department party, so they probably all knew this guy is just want to do such things. But it's a very simplistic sort of observation. There's too many people on the planet. We already have overpopulation and global warming. Stop having children, Maluli, or whatever. In a sense, that's not the solution. China tried that. It didn't work for them, in terms of the 1 baby rule. That kind of blew up in their face. It caused a lot of female infanticide. A lot of people just had accidentally dead daughters, so you got more men than female. And most civilizations, when they get to a certain level of complexity, the population peters out. And then we see this over and over amongst the third world. When the third world gets productive and more like first world, they stop having many children. Basically, women who have a choice don't want more than 1 or 2. And so there's no real worry. This is managing itself, the population thing. Regardless, let's see what happens. Hunter-gatherers have long cranial vault. Okay, their skulls are longer. Agriculturalists, their skulls are shorter. Hunter-gatherers have large, robust jaws, their mandibles. All right, the agriculturalists have smaller, more gracile, right? Robust gracile. Our lower jaw is smaller because again, we're not using it, right? Wolff's law, use it or lose it. Our food is very soft now. And our teeth are getting smaller as well. The large teeth, the small teeth. And this idea of malocclusions is in terms of holes in the teeth, closings or whatever. That's on the increase rather than the decrease. And much tooth wear, little tooth wear. And so this is an ironic thing, you might think, that that our teeth should be better because we don't use them. If we used them as much as those hunter-gatherers, who break their teeth, who are chewing on walnuts or tree bark and break their teeth occasionally, if we've seen this in the archaeology, at least we're protecting our teeth from overuse. But again, if we bring in Wolff's law, and the chemistry of this is no, when calcium, parts of our body are exposed to a lot of stress, they stay strong. When they're not exposed to a lot of stress, they go weak. The calcium ostensibly gets leached out of the bone. And so then they are weaker, so use it or lose it is very much, at work here. So this is kind of, if you see the dotted outline of the hunter-gatherer, this is the shape of the hunter-gatherer skull, versus the shape of the agriculturalist skull, right? The longer versus shorter and all that. And again, there's a nice little table breaking it out here. What's going on? Foraging, reduce of toughness of food, reduced chewing, the difficulty of chewing. And which is again this craniofacial growth, reduced growth in facial growth, reduced jaw, and all these sorts of things. And again, you might ask, wait a minute, then we're a different species, And it's like, no, this is, if you remember, kind of like Wolff's Law, but not. It was the same chapter where we talked about there's 3 different types of adaptation. You can adapt genetically. The allele frequencies, of Peruvians are going to have more frequency of alleles of high country. Indigenous Peruvians are going to have a more frequency for some genetic features, which is going to give them a bigger chest cavity. And so hypoxia, so they can, they won't get short of breath because they're living up there. But if you're a long distance runner and you want to prepare for the Olympics, you go up there to train, or you don't even have to go up there to train anymore. Now you just can wear some sort of oxygen mask that has less air to trick your body into producing more white blood cells, or you just make white blood cells, extrude them, and then inject them back into yourself right before the race, so that more blood cells can get more oxygen and oxygenate your body. So some of these things are genetic, but many of them are local adaptations to, or if you take a baby, let's take a baby from the valley, you bring him up to the Peru, there's other biological changes that happen like that, just within the life of one individual in terms of plasticity. So these shifts in skull shape are more related to plasticity and not allele frequency, changes like that. Not mutations per se, genetic mutations. All right. Okay, so again, in brief, these little cutouts are always helpful. Hunter-gatherers have bones with higher second moments of area, just the thicker bones, right? And agriculturalists have thinner bones. They have larger, bones, and it's funny, they have more osteoporosis, not less. This again is the strangest thing. Well, no, it's not. Osteoporosis is overuse of bones. So in a sense, they might have football knee or something, right, or tennis elbow more frequently. The hunter-gatherers, but again, that's because they are using their bones a lot, like football players or tennis players, right? So that's the explanation there. So, how did ag affect, our biology? That's the point here. These modern hunter-gatherers that we've seen today in the 60s, and there's an image of them right there. And that's the Hadza or the Bushmen of the Kalahari. I'm not sure, maybe Bushman. But in Lee and DeVore's work in the 60s, a variance dependent on local ecology and food, what that's doing to you in terms of dietary sorts of things. In fact, I know there's a food movement called locavore, right? You've heard of carnivore, you've heard of omnivore. Well, this other thing called locavore is only eating food that's local to where you live. And the idea behind that is, again, they're trying to think like hunter-gatherers. We want to be like how nature intended us to be. Right? The problem with that is humans have so far, we've moved to such strange places in the planet that is there enough dietary stuff there for us to really sustain ourselves? Anyway, this thing was mentioned in the video, that's linked to this chapter, but ostensibly, if you think of a femur, the longest human bone, as an I-beam in terms of how bendable it is, what we're talking about is the distance, in the center of the beam. If it's a 6-foot beam, we're talking about right at 3 feet, and how thick that is. All right, because it's the center of that that thickness, let's say it's 6 inches wide or something, 6 feet long. How that is its weakest point. And so how thick it is how strong the entire beam is. And it's similar to the femur. So if you can look at, the same halfway through the femur, and then we got the cutout, plain view of the femur, how thick the enamel or the bone part of the bone is versus the other stuff is the indicator. And that's basically what we're getting at is, depending on who you are, hunter-gatherer or agriculturalist, there's going to be a lot more thickness, of thickness of the entire femur and thickness of bone to sinew, ratio sort of thing. So as these images will detail, right? So yeah, hunter-gatherers on the left, and it's basically, it's the core is ostensibly the same in all three, but it's how thick the bone is. The core might be determined by genetics. That's just how it is. You're a human, you have bones, whatever. But how much adaptability there is in terms of, using your bone as a hunter-gatherer from 4 years old, having to walk 4 miles a day for water since you were 4 years old for your entire life or something. Then we're going to see, and then carrying the water back home. That's where we're going to see these radical differences, between bone density. And the effect on our skeleton is as well, I mean, the femur is nice because, again, that's the most frequently found bone in archaeological sites. So we can look at that over, the last 10,000 years. The author of the book, Larson, that's a lot of what he did. He was looking at an indigenous group on that island off of the East Coast. There's evidence of them before the advent of Europeans and before the advent of the agricultural revolution and after. So you can see, what they were, just indigenous hunter-gatherers, and then when they domesticated plants and animals, and then when Europeans came, colonists, and all the variety of changes. But another problem that is coming up, another one of the costs, is, again, this idea of disease. Again, if we compare this to wild animals, diseases, most diseases need to be spread. They arrived in one organism and they jump to yours. They jump to yours from the same species organism or from a different organism, most likely same species. But the trick is, if you're isolated from those other guys, you're less likely to suffer disease. So the spread of, like, epidemics are a side effect of dense population. They are not a side effect of virulent diseases. Right? That's a really important distinction here. Like AIDS, COVID is too close to even talk about because it's, we've all known somebody who's died of COVID. I'm not talking about COVID, but in terms of AIDS is a good one. It's a little more distant. It's spread when AIDS, hit the human population. It spread across the globe very rapidly, and did horrendous damage in terms of killing people, both hetero and homosexual people. It's just spread. But the point is, AIDS, that same virus package, in a sense, was not unique to humans. It had been found in animal populations, prior to it being, crossed over to humans. But why don't we see this huge pandemic, monkey AIDS or tiger AIDS, wipe out all the tigers, wipe out all the monkeys, sort of. And we don't see that, of course, because of carrying capacity. Monkeys do not overpopulate. They can't overpopulate because they're naturally, if there's less food in where they're all living, women start lactating less frequently. And so they become less able to have babies, basically. If a drought is suffering by a troop of apes or monkeys, let's say, the frequency of babies being born drops. So it's not as bad as, oh, my baby, I can't feed him because there's not enough of us. if you think of it and stretched out over 25 years or whatever, no, it's the fact that the females of your group are going to become less fertile. They're gonna have periods less frequently. They might stop a period, just for a year or two. And so in that sense, this is another way that populations control themselves. After the agricultural revolution, there's no natural control, of Homo sapiens population. Now we just reproduce and live in societies. So as a result, there's this overcrowding, and any disease somebody has, it's going to jump to somebody else. All right. Let's see, and syphilis is a horrible one. Tuberculosis, mumps, cholera, flu, smallpox, and of course, like if we think of in the New World, Europeans came to the New World, and one of the things we Europeans had been doing is living really closely together with each other and really closely together with animals. People in the New World hadn't been doing that yet, so we had suffered a couple of plagues, even. So as a result, we have a great deal of antibodies in our system. The Europeans did that; those in the New World did not. North and South America. So in one sense, when the Europeans came over, the biggest way that the Europeans killed New Worlders was most likely pathogenically, not through swords or guns and all that. But I mean, of course, we did a lot of damage with that. But pathogenically, we might have wiped out a lot more before we even seen a group of Indians. We could have, killed them off with, like the big ones, tuberculosis and smallpox. All right. The tooth decay is another strange one. The high carbohydrate effect of our dietary shift produces lactic acid. Okay, if you're eating a lot more carbs than a hunter-gatherer who just doesn't have access to carbs, not that they wouldn't wish to if they could. Okay, what do? I spend the next 3 hours scratching around for some berries that are going to be bitter, but they're not going to kill me. Or I could be handed a bag of chips. Anybody would choose the chips over 3 hours of scratching for berries, with the same amount of proteins in both cases. But the proteins, for the hunter-gatherer are all you're getting is the proteins, very few sugars, so it's not hurting your teeth at all. The bag of chips, it's going to rapidly, it might probably even added sugar into it, but the carbs turn into lactic acid. Lactic acid is then rotting your teeth. So agriculturalists have a lot more tooth decay than hunter-gatherers. All right, and that's an utterly dietary effect. Maybe agriculturists can afford dentists though, and hunter-gatherers can't. So that's in a sense, it sounds great to be a hunter-gatherer. We'd live longer, we'd be healthier, but we'd have no access to education, to schooling. We couldn't just sit and ponder, what do I want to do for the rest of my life, for 4 years of college. That wouldn't happen without the advent of ag. So ag is by no means bad. I would prefer ag over being a hunter-gatherer any day. Okay. Let's see, the variety lacking in agriculture, dietary variety. This is another thing. Just variety is good. Variety is healthy. Before the advent of multivitamins, variety was required for any member of the planet who needed, a variety of different vitamins, nutrients, minerals, all these different things that we need. Of course, 10,000 years ago, nobody knew that. And 10,000, we just ate when we were hungry, now food's easy. So in a sense, this whole, like I said about the Irish potato famine type of thing, people are suffering then from nutritional deficiencies, and other things like, enamel hypoplasia, again, thin enamel. So your teeth are rotting. And so all of these things are happening slowly. kind of like when Vasco da Gama and all those guys were coming up Alta California's coast from Spain. They were dying of scurvy. Okay. Scurvy is an absence of vitamin C. They could have stopped on the coast anywhere and eaten some of the local fruit, and they wouldn't have died. But they didn't. They did stop, killed some Indians, picked up some water, but they kept eating their beef jerky, Spanish beef jerky or whatever, salted pork and all this sort of stuff. And they weren't eating any citrus, or any sorts of fruits, which again were right there in sight of them, which would have prevented their scurvy. And so again, these are the problems that come along with agriculture. Iron deficiency might be another thing, which where is iron? Iron's not only in meat. It is, of course, in meat. So if you were a hunter-gatherer, maybe most of your iron's coming from meat. But even an agriculturalist, if all you're growing is corn and all you're eating is corn, corn in Mexico, potatoes in Ireland, why not grow some greens as well? Because greens have a lot of iron in them, and it's like, it's a lot easier to just grow potatoes or corn. And so yeah, I mean, you don't have to eat meat to get iron. You can get iron from elsewhere. But so yeah, iron deficiency is bad. That's another thing I forgot about. That corn itself reduces iron absorption. So that's particularly worse in the Central American context. You're eating more and more corn, and if the more corn you eat, the more iron you need to consume. It's not like if you eat corn, you have to take an iron pill. No, but just if you're eating greens with your corn, in a sense, you're fine. But this iron deficiency can come in a variety of ways, and hookworm is a common third world horror. You don't want to see it. I saw it in the Peace Corps. It's just dastardly, just wear chancla or shib, wear sandals if you ever go in the third world and walk around on the dirt. Never walk around barefoot to avoid hookworm. Okay, so yeah, variety of diseases, and that's the point too. In these early 10,000 years, we're not aware of any of these diseases, right? We didn't know about any of these sorts of diseases until around 80 years ago. So this sort of thing is happening. This malnutrition is happening generation after generation to people, and they're just living shorter lives, and that's just how it is in that place with that agricultural community or whatever. It's normalized basically. So if you're a hunter-gatherer, your likelihood of infection from a cold is low. Dental problems low. The child growth and developmental problems don't exist. Or they're normal or whatever, I guess. Your enamel problems, like thin enamel and all that, is low. Iron deficiency is low, so you don't have iron deficiency. All of these things because of dietary things. And your adult height. Oh, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. Hunter-gatherers are taller than agriculturalists. So our population has shrunk, since the advent of agriculture. So conversely, it's the opposite. All the bad things, more infection, more dental problems. The child growth and developmental problems, no, they're reduced in a sense. So that's the one benefit. But still, it's worse on our teeth. It's worse on our iron consumption, and it's worse on our height. If height matters. Are we still evolving? Another question. As a discussion question, just ponder this for a second. I can't divide the class really into two, but if I were to do such a thing, I would ask one group, to prepare an argument for the benefits of agriculture, and the other group, I would prepare an argument against the benefits of agriculture. Basically, if you were here and you had like godlike powers, 12,000 years ago, what would you do? Would you somehow prevent humanity, Homo sapiens sapiens, from figuring out ag, or would you not? And so that would be the question. The answer, which I'll provide, is on the one hand, agriculture, like I said, has all these bad problems. There's a guy, a geographer, who's written extensively about this. He wrote a book called Collapse. Jared Diamond is his name. And a lot of his point is this, that yeah, agriculture was in many ways the worst thing humanity has ever done. It's the worst thing we've done to our species. Even if you think about it in an evolutionary sense, in terms of threatening our extinction, agriculture might be the biggest threat to our extinction. If you take the reasoning all the way out, meaning mass agriculture meant mass population. Mass population meant mass civilization. Mass civilization has brought us to global warming, because not only are we're just pumping so many biogases, from cows, forget about cars, just eating meat and all the biological gases that is shrinking our global sunglasses, in a sense, to increase global warming. So we might make ourselves extinct because of agriculture, you could say, in the most extreme version of it. But on the converse, I'm glad I'm not a hunter-gatherer. I'm glad all 5 of my children are alive. My eldest had a huge medical problem when she was a baby. When she was like 1 or 2 years old, she had all these UTIs, and then we found out her kidney was in the wrong place. And her temperature was 104. Several trips to the ER in the middle of the night, I remember, just horrifying. Almost lost her. Could have died. She had been a hunter-gatherer. She wouldn't have made it to age 4. She'd just be taken right out of the gene pool. And the fact that one of her kidneys is in the wrong place doesn't mean anything. It means she should not play contact sports. Because it's right like where her stomach is. And it's a common, although it's infrequent, it is a common mutation amongst human populations, and it's survivable. Most people don't notice it, and that's what they say. Just don't play football, don't play baseball, soccer, things that could hit your core. But yeah, be a runner, be in the gym, a swimmer, and all that. Fine. So I much prefer the choice we made, in a sense. It's nice in the book Collapse. Jared Diamond does point out a nice solution. He compares 2 societies. He compares Easter Island, which was a place that basically, suffered from agriculture and overpopulation. And the archaeological evidence is that they basically, towards the end, Easter Island is the one with those big rock faces that are all looking towards the east, but basically, humanity or modern, colonists got there and it's empty. And what happened was they overpopulated. They grew too fast to maintain themselves. And once you get to a point where it's too high, there's no way to control it anymore. You can't just say, okay, let's stop having babies. And now there's just way too many people and not enough food. That led to cannibalization and people just killing each other to eat towards the end. And archaeological evidence illustrates it. So that was Easter Island. At the same time, feudal era Japan. We have Japan, and this is what Jared Diamond does. There were 2 different examples of how early humans went to islands that were ostensibly isolated, and one of them, basically ate themselves to death, and the other one, Japan, didn't. They somehow were able to survive and manage. And I mean, the whole book gets into the variances of the 2. And it's not to say that people from Japan are better than people, who now live on Easter Island. It's just that humans with culture have the power to make all sorts of choices. They can be bad and good. So I guess if it were me and I was back there 12,000 years ago, what I would have said is, yeah, totally do the agriculture, but also make a rule that says no big cities, that somehow, 1,000 is the biggest city you can have. If there's more than 1,000, people got to move, and if there's no more places to move, then you got to figure out other solutions or something. And so Imagine our planet, and all we were is these small groupings, or even just if we still somehow stayed at not even 1,000 people, at groupings of just 500, or 200 or something, and lived a little more in touch with the environment, a lot more locavore type of stuff going on. I mean, that is a possibility that our culture, that humanity could have taken potentially, if things had been a little different. I mean, it's unlikely because in the early history, and that's again the last 5,000 years, once we had civilization-sized things, the first thing people did, again, my imaginary 5 kids, two of them are doing agriculture, so now no, these other 3 don't need to worry about food. Well, the next 2 of them are going to be soldiers. That's the next thing that happens. Because one thing you got to do is someone's got to protect that agricultural land, because we're not moving anymore. We're staying in one spot. So maybe you need one soldier just to guard against other people who are going to steal your food, or just wild animals who want to walk on your land. The second soldier might be thinking about expanding our holdings. Why not grab those neighbors too, and enslave them and have them do our farming for us? And so sadly, human greed, it seems to have really marked itself. Another discussion question, what technological changes associated with agriculture? What were there? What sorts of technological changes occurred that enabled agriculture? Again, the development of fertilizer, like I mentioned earlier, was a huge, clever solution. People kept farming the same area, of course, with the same seeds, same plants, same everything. And then all of a sudden, the land stopped working. It went fallow, and then they're thinking, what the hell happened? I don't know how they figured out, animal poop has nitrogen in it. And what your plants have been doing is basically leaching the nitrogen out of the ground. So you got to put nitrogen back in the ground. I mean, that's in a nutshell one of the big points about fertilizer. How did they first figure that out? Who knows? It's natural, you could say, if they just sat there and watched animals, going to plants, wild plants, and pooping right there below them, and somehow the tree's living. But regardless, that's just one small technology. Even if you think about it, like I said in earlier lectures, well, no, this is in my cultural class, the difference between an agriculturalist versus a animal husbandry. If all you do is manage 1,000 cows, or 10,000 sheep, you don't need that much technology. It's pretty easy to do, And I know it sounds complicated, birthing a foal and all that sort of stuff. I would never do it. But compared to agriculture, the level of technological expertise is vastly different. So animal husbandry, low tech, low cultural, training and all that. For ag, high tech. You really have to learn a lot throughout the seasons, different plants, different seasons. Not only that, you need technology, you need tools, that you only use maybe once a year, like a plow, but it's a critical tool, so you need to store it somewhere. Again, you got to stay in one place. So that is another invitation for cultural complexity. With all of this technological transfer, it's really important for that old geezer who only has one leg and he's half blind, and one arm. Like, remember what was he? I think he was a Neanderthal, skeleton that was mentioned yesterday. They kept him alive somehow. Maybe in the case like this, it would be, yeah, that guy knows all how to plant anything. He can plant kumquats, sugar beets, whatever we got. He's a huge benefit culturally. He's like a database, So in a sense, keeping people like that alive, it brings on all these other cultural complexity, opportunities to grow and expand. So another question that you could think about in more a modern era, but I just want you to reflect on it, not really talk about it, but genetically modifying food is a huge thing going on now. Monsanto is a company that when students give presentations in my class, Monsanto has often become this big evil plant or whatever. I mean, one thing that they've done, which I know is sounds shocking, is they'll make a seed that will grow your crop, but the seed will be like a mule. So the seed will grow wheat, but the wheat that comes out of it, you can't use it to grow more wheat, which is always how it was. You'd buy seed for a year, you'd plant your crops, and then the crops would produce seeds. You'd sell most of them off, but you'd keep some to plant your crops for next year. So then companies started making seeds that would not produce seeds that would grow crops. In one sense, they were saying, "Oh, that's the control for the bugs or whatever." But in another, it's capitalism in a sense. Now you got to keep coming back to me to buy more seeds. So stuff like that, once big business has gotten involved in it, it sounds scary. But one thing before I move on, the idea of genetically modifying, some people are afraid. I do not want to eat any genetically modified anything. I just want to eat natural, wild food or whatever. That ship left 10,000 years ago. At some level, all of the food that we're eating, or at least the vast majority of it, has been genetically modified to some extent. I mean, we didn't go in and do gene splicing, but even to the case of my blueberry bush example in the beginning, that is a genetic modification. It was allele frequencies in those seeds that I chose to eat. Some of the blueberries I didn't eat. Oh, God, that tastes like crap, And so nobody ate that blueberry bush seeds, We all ate the other 2 blueberry bush seeds, and we spread those genes. That's genetic modification already, on more of a natural level. But once you get into domestication, plants, again, in the last 10,000 years, people have been specifically choosing grains of corn to plant and not choosing others. That is also genetic modification. So we've been doing it, for quite some time. So there's no getting out of that one. So I got 2 more discussion questions. And then there's just one video clip that I wanted to watch. How will human activities change the evolutionary context of our species on the planet? How will this feedback in changing the evolutionary context for humans? So again, Larson over and over is bringing us back to this question of this feedback loop. Nurture, nature, one influencing the other. What is the role of globalization in changing the human food supply or in changing the role of disease in human adaptation? In this broadest sense, I guess throughout the whole course, we've been thinking about this feedback loop, the influence that culture has had on the biology of ourselves and those around us, or our predecessors. To some extent, we can still be reflecting on that today in terms of, it's really small to think what my behavior can do to the gene pool. Well, maybe not mine. I have 5 children. But this reflection is not a silly one. It's a core part of anthropology and this holistic perspective we have of humanity, where humanity has been and where humanity is going. These are both critical questions that anthropologists are interested in discussing. My last question, to reflect on is, it's often asked, have humans stopped evolving? Discuss the premise of this question, discuss what it would take for evolution to stop, and discuss the ways in which the effects of evolution may change for humans rather than simply stop. Again, if we're alive, we're evolving. There's no way to not do that. If you recall, the Hardy-Weinberg equation is a hypothetical based on 0 environmental changes. That is an impossibility. There's no way to stop environmental changes from happening. Or I guess you could control where they're at. Like if you would need a really complicated machine to take everything that's in my environment right now and to put it in some sort of a metal bottle and send it to the moon or something, right? So that I had all the microorganisms, everything. And I need my gut biome, has to be maintained for me to live exactly like I'm living. I guess you could conceivably invent such a thing if you were massive future society. But for the most part, it's impossible. Exchange, environmental change is inevitable, and hence biological pressures on us to change is constant. So yeah, one solution is, has evolution stopped? No, because we're not extinct yet. If we become extinct, yeah, then it will have stopped. But until then, it won't. So, um, all right. Now, let's see. here. Oh, sugar. I want to um, stop. Stop. Great. So, preparing for the final exam, I have taken my lecture notes and turned them into um, kind of a review document for you. I'm personally not convinced that this is going to help all of you 100%, but it might help some of you. And if it does, well, then, watch this video. But like I said, also, I used to teach educational psychology. I know psychometrics well. We all prepare for final exams in different ways. The final is just like the midterm, structurally. The same test pool with the multiple guess items and the same amount of multiple guess items and the same length of time it will be open. Everything is identical to the midterm. So structurally, no surprises. Just the content is different. So, and beyond listening to this, another way that you can prepare is you can get access to these notes yourself. And I have put some bold on areas that I think is really central. But again, this is my point. This is what I think is really central to understanding this chapter, when what you really need to know is, what questions are going to come out of the test bank, which I don't know, and I mean, I don't control it as much as you don't to keep it objective. But the other thing that can help also is in each chapter on Canvas, I've moved over the things from the textbook, all of those practice, there's the flashcards, there's the practice mini video clips and different exercises like that. So those should be maybe even more helpful than just listening to me, lecture about this stuff. But we'll see. Okay, so chapter 7, primate sociality and social behavior and culture. It's funny, I was just writing a chapter of a book that I'm writing on sociality. That was the whole title of the chapter, sociality. And all sociality means is you take the adjective social and you kind of turn it into a noun so you can talk about it a little more objectively, I guess. Sociality. Another way to say it would be the social. But at this level of primate behavior that we're getting into in terms of the, kind of the history of our species and what led up to us, the expansion of our ability to, or our predecessors' ability to be social with each other is a critical component of the story. There's often the chicken and egg issue. Which came first, a bigger brain or, a byproduct of a bigger brain? Being social takes a great deal of intelligence and a great deal of brain power. Even just any human language, any language at all, a big part of how we communicate is imagining what the other person is hearing. If we couldn't do that, like I'm saying out words, and I'm imagining what you're hearing. And that is a critical component to my ability to communicate. If we didn't have that ability, our language would break down, communication would break down. Or there'd be a heck of a lot more checking, like, did you understand? Did you understand? So just that little aspect. So was being social the cause of a bigger brain, or was a bigger brain the cause of being social? And again, this is the complex problem of nature nurture, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? We don't know. And again, the author always talks about a complex feedback loop. That's what Larson will always say. There's a complex feedback loop. So yes, the primate societies is a great example. The primate societies are diverse, they're complex, they're long-lasting. Ostensibly, any type of social grouping that we can imagine, seemingly, has been illustrated by some group of living primates today. Some groups will mass in over 50 members, and it's interesting, those groupings, because when food is scarce, I recently read an article about this, a primatology article. They might group in groups of 50 or larger. It was an old world monkey, and I forget which one. But when there's a lot of food, they'll get in these huge groups. When food is smaller, they get into smaller groups. And so they've got this dietary flexibility. But as long as there's lots of food, they want to hyper organize. And again, the only way to live in big groups is to be really socially organized, like human society. That's why we have complex society. That's why we have band, tribes, chiefdoms, state level society, because we know how to keep a lot of people together and keep it organized. So at a nascent level, we're seeing primates able to do such things. Living in a big group is definitely going to enhance one's survival from predators. Okay. Depending on the primate group, like if it's a chimpanzee society, sometimes some of your predators are within your troop. If you're males, you get into it with each other, and some chimpanzees will die as a result. Or baboons can be that way, very violent with each other. Anyway, a big part of why you would live in a bigger group is a Darwinian adaptation, of course, that it's going to increase your survival. Because just imagine a circle with the people at the edge of the circle willing to call out if there's any predators. Imagine the predator, because you're all high up in the trees, old world monkey, that you're looking down for panthers or whatever, leopards, whatever it is, some sort of carnivore. By calling out to say, hey, there's a predator coming, you've just threatened yourself. Now this predator knows where you are, and now is calculating, could I catch that particular monkey, so you've risked yourself, but you've done it at some level of, deep-seated biology, one would argue, for the group, for the genes that you're related to. This is Richard Dawkins would say, the genes that of the members of the troop that you're related to, something like a biological drive is pushing you to help them. So it's a risk to you, but you're saving them. So the panther doesn't sneak up in the middle of the whole society, the circle doesn't get past the perimeter, and get some of the babies or something. The more the primates there are, the wider the circle would naturally have to be, because we're covering for food. So in that simple sense, you can see an adaptation or a selective advantage of bigger and bigger groups. But like I said, some of these things are environmentally dependent on food availability, right? So another thing about primates that we see is the residence patterns. There's wide varieties of residence patterns, and if you remember in the slides, it could be pair bonding. One male, one female. It could be one male, multiple females. Or it could be, multiple females, multiple males. So there's almost every constellation of possibilities exist. And part of this is linked to, like I said, survival type things. Part of it is linked to, in a sense, reproductive strategies. One important thing about primate reproductive strategies, well, mammal reproductive strategies in general too, is females choose. This is a biologically governing fact, in a sense, or hypothesis that we see evidence for over and over and over, right? That females are choosing. So when we see males do stuff, you got to think they're performers. They're all actors. Even when they beat each other to death or whatever, they're still at some level acting for some woman who's watching, so that is she going to find me acceptable, so there's that level going on. When we see, size differences as well, That's another feature that it's going to illustrate itself in terms of what this might mean. But the main thing governing the whole point about women choose has two different facets to it. So in one sense, there's this idea that males are competing for access to females, and that's going to affect their entire body size relative to the female. So, there's going to be men are going to be bigger than women in some cases, and their canine size. All right. So the size of the canine, how big is it going to be? And again, it's not that they're going to be using it like the deer horns, right? Two deer smashing into each other for access to the harem of women deer or something. It's more just for threat, right? So they growl. So that's one thing that males are doing, access to females. And then another side of this is females compete with each other for resources to support their young. And in a sense, a lot of different behaviors that we see happening are still being governed by these sorts of adaptive strategies, or at least these are the main explanatory functioning principles. When primatologists will look at, well, they're doing this because of this, right? Sexual dimorphism, by the way, is the technical word. Dimorph, di means two, and morph means size, or shape. So dimorph, two size. And it's predictable if you remember that the slides do pretty well. That I had a nice little activity in this chapter 7 slides about if these primates have a great deal of sexual dimorphism, what that's going to tell you about their reproductive strategies and their social, how they socially fit, in terms of a group, individuals, whatever it is. If there's a lot of sexual dimorphism or if there's no sexual dimorphism, that tendency relates itself directly to these patterns, these cohabitation patterns. Right? All right. And this is the other thing about, we mentioned compete, females compete, males compete. And yes, that sounds bad, and people die sometimes as a result of this competition. But more importantly, again, another really important thing about primates is the sociality side. You only see competition in locations where there's a lot of cooperation. So that's the point. So there's other species that just don't cooperate at all with each other, like recently we were just watching that thing about zebras. Zebras do not cooperate with each other, it sounds like. They don't mind at all. I mean, of course they reproduce and they have drives to connect in that sexual sense, but it sounded like why humans have domesticated horses versus zebras, two animals who are very similar in terms of what they could do for humans, is it's really hard to domesticate a zebra because they don't cooperate with each other, so they're not going to cooperate with anybody else. Again, primates cooperate. I guess that's the main thing there. These altruistic behaviors, like alarm calls, like I just said, is a big one. Grooming as well. When you groom somebody else, you pick things out of its hair or whatever. That doesn't help you. I mean, it doesn't help you in terms of why are you doing that? Why are you driven to do that? Why do you want to touch other people? What's that about? Why is that in your genes? Again, this all will increase cooperation. Is the idea. Let's see. This notion about culture overall, about when we're talking about cooperation, food gaining strategies, altruistic behavior, that's kind of the big buzzword, altruistic behavior. Why are you doing something for somebody else? It gets into this issue of culture, do primates have culture, and the simple answer is yes, of course they do. depending on your definition of culture. And truly, the simplest definition of culture would include strategies that are not instinctive, that you pass from one member of a group to the next. Okay. We can think about it, for example, making a peanut butter jelly sandwich. All right. You've picked up that strategy somehow. You know, from some other member of our human species. All right. You weren't born with that technology to how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich. Someone trained you to do it, or you observed someone doing it so often that you have trained yourself to do it by watching enough. That's called legitimate peripheral participation. People have allowed you to watch them, and then they've encouraged you, and then now you're doing it yourself. I have a guy going into 6th grade. He can now make his own peanut butter jelly sandwich, you know, and the guys going into 4th grade, forget about it. You know, I can't even encourage them, but they watch, you know, so they're getting there. If chimpanzees, let's say, if any primate, and a chimpanzee is a primate, have any features that include that, then they have culture. Okay, so that's the beauty of science. You get the veto rule. So when Jane Goodall saw that chimpanzee take a stick, stick it into a hole, you know, of termites, wait for the termites to grab onto the stick, pull the stick out with the termites and lick it, she knew there was culture, you know, because she later confirmed that was not a strategy that all chimpanzees do all over the globe. Okay, that is something that they figure out. There are multiple ways that it can be figured out. So often you'll see a mother doing it with her kid and the kid is watching, you know, so then there's the schooling going on. So there's training of culture. So it is getting passed from one chimp. So one chimp figured out how to do it. Other chimps watch that chimp do it. And now those chimps are doing it. Boom. You know, we have culture right there to that extent. Or at least the best part would be a mother training her child to do it, correcting the child or something. You know, then you could say cultural transmission is definitely going on. So, boom. Yeah, there we go. So that solves that question. What this question only gets complicated when we think of culture as complex, like the jumping into the communication thing. Do primates have language other than humans? Do non-human primates have language? That would be the question. My answer would be no, you know, and I have a master's degree in linguistics, so I'm not just babbling here. But they absolutely have communication. But bees have communication too. You know, communication. Great many animals with very small and very large brains have communication. Communication is not the question. The question is complex language, you know, where you can talk about, you know, yesterday we covered this in class. Tomorrow, if then we're going to cover that in class or something. That is hyper complex, and a 4-year-old could figure that out, you know, that sort of thing I said. So the vocal communication of primates is simplistic. Like chimps, I think apes in general can make around 12 different sounds that have meaning, that have been recorded as having meaning. And there's a lot you can do with 12 sounds, you know, with big enough brains, like a warning call versus subservience call. No, you're the boss. I'm not questioning you, you know, and all this sort of stuff. You know, can I pick bugs out of your hair? So they have complex communication. There was one article I didn't share in class, but the idea of the musculature of the simian face, ape face, like apes have all sorts of muscles around their eyes and face and lips and all that we do not have, that could increase their ability to make different sort of you know. They could make different sort of facial communication activities just with their facial muscles. One's like, you know, Mona Lisa's smile or something, you know, little mini sort of things that they can do that humans can't do. It's a hypothesis that with all that extra musculature, they might be able to do acrobatical sort of things with their face that humans can't do. And maybe that was a change. We opted for language. They opted to keep their face that had all that muscle, so they could just do a lot of innuendo and unwritten, and sort of language like that to communicate. I should say, I'm sorry, communicate, not language. The interesting thing, like I mentioned, this was in class, the playback experiments that have been used, that primates respond to vocalizations, of group members very well. This idea was a group of mothers, and the group of babies of each of those mothers. They would took the babies away and played the voices of the third primate's baby. That third primate mother, the mother of that baby, looked at the microphone, the speaker where the noise was coming out of at the zoo. All the other mothers did not look at the speaker. They looked at the mother of that baby, And so that, for one, automatically tells you they're really good at hearing, in terms of when it's primate babies, they can hear which baby is which I can't do. I had twins. When one of the damn babies is crying, one of them's crying. But they were able to distinguish which baby was crying, and they were more concerned about the mother of the crier than the crier herself or himself. Well, that tells you something. Let's see. But again, the vocalizations, these 12 sounds for chimpanzees, I think it is, are pre-programmed. Those are instinctive. So that is not culture. That is more instinctual. Okay, chapter 8, fossils and their place in time and nature. The word is taphonomy, right? That's the 2-cent or 25-cent vocabulary word, taphonomy, which is just how fossils are created. And so why don't they just say fossilization? Well, I agree with you. All right. It's the study of what happens after, like I said, what happens to an organism's remains after death. And this is actually, taphonomy is where you luck out, right? Because most of the time what happens is most organisms rot and turn into nutrients for the soil to consume into plants, so that animals can eat those plants, and poop them out and all that sort of stuff. So not many, things get fossilized. Most of them just go back into the environment and get used again. So how does a fossil become a fossil? Well, again, if you get the lucky, perfect storm, kind of the Goldilocks, as it were, you're looking for an environment that has no oxygen or very little oxygen, an anoxic environment, which is the problem, because if you're an animal, you need oxygen, right? And so you're talking about where's an environment that has no oxygen, and why the hell would I go there? There was one great example of a plesiadapiphore, if you remember. I think it's in a different chapter, but the idea was that this plesiadapiphore was at the edge of a lake, and that, a hypothesis, and that this lake would occasionally belch out a plume of gas that would have been noxious to the animal. I forget what gas it was, but swamp gas, we'll call it. And so the idea was that this animal was just there looking for food or whatever, and then all of a sudden died, fell into the water, fell to the bottom of the lake, and the silt and soil content was sufficient enough that she just went right under into the mud. And then, so she's not floating around in water that has oxygen in it, but now she's deep into muddy soil that gets covered over, and all the, all the oxygen and water is now getting removed from there. The lake recedes, it's the end of the summer or whatever, it recedes further back. And so, because that find was like a perfect skeleton, I think it was. Plesiadapiphore. I'd be wrong. So that's the other thing. There's different types of fossils that can be found as well. The one I just explained is the classical type, sedimentary, where the sediments are slowly being leached out, the organic ones, and replaced with rock, basically. Take out the organics and put in rock. And then the Fayum region in Egypt is a great example. and that's 31 million years ago of the luck, as it were. There are certain areas, that have certain types of soil, and then that have certain climatic things going on that is like a perfect storm. So 31 million years ago, I mean, Egypt, I lived in Egypt for 3 years, it was really hot. If you think Fresno's hot, you don't know anything, and really dusty. Your desk would have dust all over it every morning if you left the window open the night before, to sleep and cool off, because it's a desert, But 31 million years ago, it was basically just like the equator. It was a tropical rainforest, and the soil type was very helpful for the preservation of fossils. So we have a great many fossils there. Right? So it's not the only place in Africa where stuff was going on, but it's a place where we know stuff was going on because fossils were preserved there, and maybe they weren't preserved elsewhere. All right. All right. Let's see. Just how old is the past? It's funny, and this is what time is relative to our conception of it. I was just talking about chapter 10, the last 10,000 years of life for our species, and we were talking about years ago, right? Years, not even years ago, but years before the present. Y, lowercase y, B, P, years before the present. So it's 10,000 years before the present, rather than saying 8,000 BC, which is complicated. You got to do math or whatever. You just say 10,000 YBP, right? So time is relative. In this chapter, we talked a lot more about geologic time than we did in any other chapter. And so eras, and epochs and stuff like that were coming up, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. So the one important point about this chapter too that needs to be stressed is a rather simplistic comment, but a critical one, that climate is the main driver, or what was it? No, weather is the main driver of climate. And again, that's like, duh. It doesn't climate mean weather? It's like, wait a minute, hey, And the more I thought about it after, the chapter said it, the more I thought, no, technically there is a big difference, I mean, it might be 90 degrees right now, but that doesn't tell me what it's going to be today. So the weather versus the climate might tell me it's going to go up to 101 today, but then at night it's going to go down to 66 or something. That might be more climate related sort of thing. And in 3 months, it's going to be 60 every day or something. So that's climate versus weather, I guess you could say. But relative weather, how the weather is the main thing when we're talking about most of geologic time, and most of the big geologic time shifts are weather related. There was a huge cooling at the end of the Miocene, and over and over we keep hearing that reference. The only thing that contradicts that point I just made, that weather is the main governing principle. Well, there's two things. One is plate tectonic shifts are happening, and those are controlled by geothermal, the Earth changing, and the kt boundary, if you remember that one, when that big meteor hit the Earth around the Yucatan Peninsula and basically threw us into something similar to a nuclear winter, and just made the planet get, the planet was the equator. The temperatures at the equator had expanded vastly after the KT boundary. Then those sorts of temperatures radically decreased. The whole planet got really cold. All right. Let me see. So the different types of dating, again, this chapter focused a lot about different dating techniques. It's impossible to learn all of them unless you are, a paleontologist and really into this stuff. At least it's impossible for me to learn them all because there are so many different ones. But if we talk about the big groupings of them, stratigraphic dating is one type. And basically that meant strata. The older, like your laundry at home, the laundry basket. You have a laundry basket. You threw in some shirts on Monday, and then on Tuesday, other shirts. On Wednesday, more shirts. The shirts on the bottom have been there the longest. The shirts on the top have been there the shortest amount of time. That's stratigraphic dating. And it's still very helpful. And then there's chemical types of dating, which again go, if you remember, chemicals within the rock that we find, or fossils or whatever. Fluorine is an example of that. That's a chemical. We know certain properties about that chemical that are predictable. And so with that, we can, do different sorts of chemical dating techniques. Biostratigraphic or faunal, dating is the idea that how deep the faunal is, and then compared to other things around there. If you see this, like if you remember from the chapter, there was a hut or something, some human habitation. They used wood to build that habitation. That wood, you could do dendrochronology on it, pre-ring count, and then you could link it up to other trees that were in the forest that time, link it up to third trees that weren't in the forest that time, but part of that tree, the first 50 years of that tree might have been the last 50 years of some other tree, versus a tree that's alive today, or a tree that was in a place where you can specifically date something. And so by doing those different means of triangulation, you can build a database of how old something is. Cultural dating, again, is like stone tool technology. The Mousterian stone tool technology was the most recent, right, that we talked about most recently for early Homo sapiens. And the earlier, it's Oldowan, right? And then I can't, I'm drawing a blank right now, but the oldest tool technology was Oldowan. So if we see something that they're using those tools, well, we know, oh yeah, it's got to be at least that old. It's at least 2 million years old if they're using those things. All right. Dendrochronology, that's the tree ring counting, like I said. Radiometric, this is another type of thing where we're looking at the carbon atoms, for example, the ch13. We know very specifically how long its half-life is, and if you can measure the half-life, and that the carbon in the environment before and after it was eaten, or basically you cut the plant and then either ate it or carried it with you as a stick or something, that sort of thing, exactly. Well, this was cut 8,500 years ago or something. So yeah. Well, no, I'm sorry, I wouldn't be with radiocarbon. Radiocarbon, again, is limited, and that's another important point about all these different dating techniques. They have limitations. Radiocarbon is perfect if it's between 50 and 70,000 years old. If it's not, it's useless. It won't tell you anything with any sort of precision. And that is the point about all of these dating techniques. You've got to become a jack of all trades and become familiar with all of them, because depending on the area that you're looking, it's going to be contingent on what sort of dating techniques you're going to be able to avail yourself of and be able to potentially use. Okay, like I said, I'm iterating it now. The driving force in shaping environment is temperature. Yeah, that was the point. Temperature drives climate, which is linked to biology and chemistry. And again, it sounds, again, temperature drives climate, yeah, duh, and all that, but no, it's really significant. It's hard for us to think about that because we have so perfected culture to the point where environment hardly affects us. Yeah, we can whinge a little about how hot it is today or tomorrow, or how cold it is, or oh, it's so rainy, oh, I got to shovel snow today, boo hoo. But in truth, go camping to see how much the environment can really cause you trouble, because that's the point. When you're camping, life can be really tricky. If you're camping and it's raining, got to set up your tent and all that sort of stuff. Now your shoes are wet, and that's nothing compared to a drought, and you're living off the land, I would imagine. So yeah, the idea of temperature is really significant. So The last thing about this chapter to point out is this idea of time, space, habitat, and diet are important factors in the interpretation of the fossil record. This is what I was trying to say a moment ago, that all of these dating techniques, basically, you have to kind of become familiar with all of them, because only some of them will work in certain contexts. Furthermore, because none of them are perfectly reliable, if you can use multiple different dating techniques, you can increase the reliability through triangulation. All right, so chapter 9, we're talking about the origins of primates from the first 50 million years, we could say. And again, a lot of people don't like this chapter because they'll think this is not really primates. We don't know what the hell those things are and all that. I love this chapter because I love to think broadly about what we did and how we did adapt, where we got and all this sort of thing. So why did primates emerge? Again, in a nutshell, we can think of the ch13 boundary, right? And that kind of supports this arboreal hypothesis. We adapted to live in the trees. Who else adapted to live in the trees? Let's say what other mammals? Forget about birds, because birds aren't a problem. If a mammal wants to get rid of a bird, pretty easy. You just say shoo or whatever. I mean, look at cats in the United States today. They've become an incredible problem for bird wildlife. Ask any ornithologist and they'll say, yeah, the fact that you let your cat outside in the backyard, it's a real problem, for birds. So if we talk about mammals, and the different places that mammals have adapted to, what mammals have adapted to live in the trees? Not many, other than primates. And so that's the kind of the point. After the ch13 boundary, after that big meteor, through the thing, and the dinosaurs died out, and then mammals that were really small prior to the dinosaurs ruling the planet, mammals were able to start getting big and start filling the ecological niches. It's niche, you'll see it without an S because it's Latin, but the ecological zones, the ecological places that were previously taken over by dinosaurs, reptiles. Now mammals can grow into all of those things, right? And you got 4 legs, a strong gut. You go for the grasses, right? You want to eat things that eat on the grasses. You become a lion or a tiger. One group of mammals went to the trees, and that was the ones that eventually evolved into primates. And that's basically the hypothesis. There's the hand grasping that we see, the binocular vision, the fact that we have depth perception, jump from branch to branch, is all of this sort of thing. Then we start talking about feedback loop stuff. Visual predation, hunting with your eyes, requires good eyes. Maybe you need to see at night. Maybe you need to see in color. Maybe you need to have depth perception. All of that is demanding more brain power or more computational power. All of those things, seeing at night, seeing in color, seeing in depth, requires bigger brains. Bigger brains requires more proteins. So maybe you're going to eat more meat. Maybe you're going to be a predator, a visual arboreal predator. Even if what your predation is crickets, it's still better than eating fruit potentially. Another big hypothesis is this angiosperm hypothesis. That's fruit, whenever you see that word, but the idea that, again, these early pro-simian, the pre-primates, adapted for color vision, and the grasping hands and all that, so we could get out to the edge of a limb of a tree with a really small branch and eat some fruit that's out there, one little cherry that's left, and get the last cherry and survive from that. And we ate the red cherry that's ripe, not the yellow cherry that's raw. Hence the color vision, might have been helpful. So that's this idea of how these pre-primates might have made their selective choices. The first true primates, the euprimates in the Eocene epoch, start really showing up around 55 million years ago. And the clearer primate traits, is this post-orbital bar post-orbital bar, and a large brain, relative in body size. Back there on this post-orbital bar on the side. And so this first split that we see is the adipids and the omoids, which is an older taxonomic thing. Again, as you know, I prefer the Haplerheim and the Streptorheim, which these guys will match up to. But widely diverse. Another thing about primates today, well, even these proto-primates or whatever, there's something about them in terms of generalization, a genetic bucket that can seem to adapt and to a variety of different things, and that might have been the biggest gift of all. Living today, there are over 200 species in the group primate, that I don't know any other group like that has that many, and I have to look it up. Maybe there's one insect that has that, but I don't think there's any other mammal that comes anywhere near close to this one group of primates that has so much variance. Variance from 2 ounces to 2 tons, right? That is variance. And here we can see in this early area, the adipids and the omoids, they diffused and were able to, go in all sorts of different directions. And all over as well, planetary wide, they got around. There's the weird thing, or at least it's your common sense would challenge it in a sense, is this idea of the origins of New World higher primates. How did New World monkeys get to the New World? And it's really bizarre because plate tectonics, the New World had already long since broken off from the Old World. So they couldn't have been there and then left. No evidence of that. And they weren't around. This is way before then. So this idea of either there's a couple of different hypotheses. They co-evolved independently. Almost nobody suggests that because there's no fossil evidence to support that they evolved, that these New World monkeys, who are so similar to Old World monkeys, that they evolved even independently, from some sort of pro-simian, they evolved in. So they were the same, and then they got over there. So that's one hypothesis. But the most likely hypotheses are the ones where they somehow swam there. So a raft went from, Africa to South America. That's one common one. And a raft that was full of food, they're just following food. And then this raft moved. It would have been a huge raft, of vegetation. The most likely hypothesis is they walked from South Africa to Antarctica and from Antarctica to South America. During an era when things were much drier and the sea had receded, one of those two sides, you could just directly walk. I think it's from Africa to Antarctica. It would be pretty much a really short water crossing, if any at all. And so that's the most likely, but still, we have no idea. Okay, so apes begin in Africa and dominate the Miocene, and this was another weird thing, not a weird thing, but a reminder of evolution. It seemed to be, this directional path of more complex primates from Haplerheim wet nose to Streptorheim wet nose to Haplerheim, and then Haplerheim to monkey, and then monkey to ape, and then ape to human, as if it's progress. So in this era, if that was the plan, in a sense, in this era, we see this huge profusion of apes, all right, dominating the Miocene. They're getting around, all right. They left Africa, they're going up into Europe, they're going over to South Asia and all this sort of stuff. And diverse number of taxa, over 10 genuses, over 15 species. And that's, that's again, this idea of they're finding different niches. They're out competing monkeys and other dominant primates who want to be the arboreal masters of the neighborhood. These guys are somehow pushing them out. And so, woohoo, right? So great for them, right, Roger? We're on our way up. What happens though is, this is where you see this guy Gigantopithecus, Gigantopithecus, right? This giant 10-foot primate, right? The missing link, right? Um, and but so all sorts of variety of primates, that we are definitely dominating, and complex primates are dominating the most. So now we're getting around everywhere, yay! But the at the end of this era, they're pretty much dying off. There's this huge, extinction sort of series. Well, it's not extinction event specifically, but basically like a lot of other species for us, like Neanderthal and Denisovans go extinct, and we're still here. This is what happened to the primates. They had a lot of them, and then most of them go extinct, except for the orangutan in Asia, and the ones that are still, at the equator in Africa. So what happened there? The important thing to happen there is a correction to human bias. I'm the one who's thinking, oh, we're all getting more complex. The mammals are getting more complex until they finally get to primate, which is the most complex mammal. And then we're getting even more complex to the ape, and humans are apes basically. And then so apes are dominating the world, planet of the apes, right? But then apes go extinct almost completely extinct, except for a few species left, right? I think 6, right? 5 or 6. And then monkeys go bananas. Sorry, couldn't help it. But then monkeys start refilling these same niches and going into other ecological niches. And like to this day, there's far more monkeys than there are apes, So what was that about? Was apes a mistake? Was apes an evolutionary kind of dead end? And again, I keep trying to think about this in terms of progress, that somehow humans are the best. And we are in not best, but we are the most complex of all the apes. We're the most complex, which means we're the most complex of all the mammals. And maybe mammals are more complex than lizards and all this, but the evolution game is not a direction, a trajectory, and the disappearance of all the apes, as it were, most of them, is a great example of that. So now monkeys, is the next step up. Monkeys are getting around. New world, old world. They're radiating in all these different potential places, in the early Miocene. So there we go. Yay. The planet of the monkeys is now what we live on, in a sense, right? So chapter 10, early hominin origins, which is where we find our roots. Where does bipedal locomotion begin? How does it begin? Is important. And this is where we're beginning to see it. Another big feature is this non-honing canines. The lower teeth, below our canine, the complex of teeth, the non-honing complex, basically it's a non-sharpening set of teeth below the canine, right? So, which again is another huge. So we go bipedal. Our teeth start getting wimpier, right? So what's that about? The Darwin's hypothesis about why we became bipedal, most would agree is wrong. Some wouldn't. Darwin knew geologically that savannas and woodlands were increasing at the advent or around the advent of bipedal locomotion. So his thought was, these early primates started walking because they had to go out in the savannah. They wanted to stand up, look over the grasses for prey or predators or whatever, or walk from forest to forest and all this sort of stuff. But I think most biological anthropologists are more convinced with existing data that now illustrates we became bipedal in the forest a little earlier than the onset of this huge grassland explosion. So why did that happen? We see gorillas and chimpanzees who are, 80-20, they're knuckle draggers. They do most of their locomotion on 4 appendages, but some of it on 2, and they're living in the forest, then why did some of us somehow become bipedal and still live in the forest? was living on was walking on two legs, in the trees, somehow help us climb the trees better. There's all sorts of hypotheses, which again we do not know. And so this patchy forest hypothesis by one Rodman and McHenry, that's basically the one I just said. Owen Lovejoy had the hypothesis of provisioning, that no, we became those of us who had the accidental kind of mutations that led towards bipedalism were able to care for their young better. The women could carry the baby, but the man who was the father of that baby was able to carry food, and go along with them. And those babies then would have survived more likely and bred more. And so then these bipedal babies with caring fathers would have outbred, the quadrupedal. That's Lovejoy's hypothesis. Whatever, who knows? Okay, all choices have their cost, of course. And in terms of the give and take, if you're bipedal, of course, you can lift, carry a lot more, but also you are a lot slower. You can't dodge and run quickly as fast, as if you're on four legs. So we're increased predation could increase, but the big advantage of bipedalism, of course, is the energy consumption. Walking on two appendages instead of four saves a lot of energy, period. So boom. All right, now we jump into the first hominins, the pre-Australopithecines. Again, there's a couple of different genuses that have been considered, but we don't know. These genuses, one of them that I mentioned, let me see which of the, Sahelanthropus chadensis is one of the biggest ones that gets credit for maybe being that split off point between 6 to 8 million years ago. Let's call it 7. That's what the book does. 7 million years ago, there was a common ancestor, and it went in one direction and eventually became humans. It went in another direction and eventually became chimpanzees. That is the closest relative we have. There was another split off like that led to gorillas, and a further split off that led to orangutans. But the most recent split off from us to any living non-human is the one with chimpanzees. And again, some would say we are 98% chimpanzee and genetically, or at least over 95%. But more recent evidence has suggested that Sahelanthropus chadensis, it wasn't even bipedal. I think they found some more ankle bones or something. So maybe he wasn't the first, pre-Australopithecine, because maybe he was a wild animal that became a chimpanzee, which is an animal, not a human, right? But nonetheless, he's an interesting one to consider. Orion turgenesis is another one. Ardipithecus is a third one. And all of these guys are genuses, okay, that are not Australopithecine. The main two genuses that are important is Australopithecine and Homo, right? And each of those genuses might have multiple species, but if we're just talking in the biggest sense, like a lumper, right? Like I am, it's Australopithecine and then Homo. And so these pre-Sahelanthropus, the Orion and Ardipithecus, there's very few bits of evidence for them. So are we related or not? Yeah, we don't know. But most of us would suggest, yes, that we are related to Australopithecines. Some Australopithecine finally begot Homo erectus. Homo erectus finally begot somebody, who became us or us. That's kind of where most people would say the journey for Homo sapiens came from. Okay. And again, Australopithecines 4 to 1 million years ago, they're the first ones. They got around, right? Louis Leakey found some, what's her name? Lucy, right? Lucy is one of the big finds. And again, there's many finds. So there's a lot of evidence to support this, which is good. The diversification of this whole group, all right, of hominins is another important point, and kind of the big evolutionary lineages, of Australopithecines, if you want to try to break them down, it would be Australopithecine gari, and then Australopithecus apithecus, right, or boisei. But yeah, so but again, I don't think you really need that level of the sub. Who did we actually, was it Africanus or Afarensis, that probably led to Homo erectus? A lot of this stuff is conjecture, and I don't think there's actual quiz questions specifically on that. So more the general pattern that we're talking about is features. What's the trend? So we're thinking about, a smaller face, smaller jaw, smaller teeth, and a pelvis that is resulting in a better walker. Australopithecines walked, but they might have been a little more bow-legged. They might not have walked as efficiently as the Homo. Some have said that Homo may have been able to run, some of the Homo, for like Homo erectus, for 8 hours, just run straight. That's something that Australopithecines probably weren't able to do, based on their pelvis. All right, brain size is the bigger one, though. They didn't get past 420 cc's, the Australopithecines. Then we get into chapter 11, which is Homo. Okay, so chapter 10 was all Australopithecines for the most part. Homo is the next one up. Louis Leakey found Homo habilis. That this is a guy that has 600 cc brain, and he's using tools. So Louis Leakey, who wanted to get on the map, first the Homo found in Africa, I think it was saying, I found Homo in Africa, rather than not Africa. A lot of people, I think, today would agree or would consider the Homo habilis really part of Australopithecine. He's 600 cc's. We just saw somebody who is 400 cc's. The next one up is 900 cc's. Again, Homo erectus. He's the big star of Homo. And we know other Australopithecines who have used stone tools, most likely, the Oldowan tool tradition. And so, in a sense, we could just say Homo habilis is Australopithecine, and Australopithecines use tools, period. And you're not in the Homo unless you have at least 900 cc's of brain capacity in your brain pan. But again, that's an important thing to remember, that the taxonomic battles will always wage. In fact, that Homo habilis becoming Australopithecine, it would be similar to how Pluto became a non-planet. Pluto used to be a planet, now it's not a planet. I could see someday, them kicking Homo habilis into the Australopithecine bucket in a very similar sort of way. It's just based on a group of agreed, the paleontologists all agreed. All right, Homo erectus, been around for 2 million years. He's the master, right? He is the most prolific member of the hominin line. Of all hominins, he's been here the longest, way longer than humans, Homo sapiens. And so, wow, almost 2 million years. He stood 6 feet. He had a big brain of 900 cc's. He left Africa. He mastered fire. He is the hero of he's the hero of the hominin hero, you might say. So, in this era, also hunting, he's doing hunting. So his nutrition is improving, or at least people that are going to evolve into us finally, our goal is all these biological changes and adaptations, which is improving our diet, improving our potential for brain capacity, our body size, and the potential for culture, so now we're living with each other more, we're caring about each other more, we're hunting as a group. It takes a lot of cooperation. All right. Let me see. And the tools, like I said, the Acheulean tool technology, is an improvement on the older one, right? Okay. Their brains go up to around 12 cc's. Now we end, in a sense, in chapter 12 with us, basically modern humans, or at least modern Homo and archaic Homo. What was going on? Different types of archaic humans. All right, our skull is now rounder. If you remember, um, what's his name? Homo erectus had a skull that looked like an American football. It was a little more oblong. Homo sapien now, or our archaic pals, is more round. It's another trend, right? The skull is getting rounder. The biggest thing that came out of this chapter, I think, was the 3 different hypotheses about how are Homo sapiens here. Did the different out of Africa model, or did we co-evolve separately from our archaic people? Because that's what we've seen. All sorts of our evidence of like Neanderthal going all over Western Europe. And then something parallel to Neanderthal called Denisovans going in separate parts of Asia. And those guys look kind of similar. They both got the thick skulls, the brow ridges and all that sort of stuff. And they're able to survive really cold temperatures. They got huge nostrils, right? They've got a variety of different large nasals, large infraorbital foramina. Again, those holes that were right here in the skull, which again is indicative of a face that has a lot more blood vessels that can go back and forth, and kind of like a radiator of a car. If you've got all these blood vessels up here and you live, basically you go walking in 20 below weather every day, it might keep your nose from getting, from freezing off and being broken off with when your appendages turn black and die. So that's the foramina. Stockier build, again, that's that law. The shorter you can stay warmer better. Bigger nose to warm the air, and a bigger inside cavity in your nasal cavity. The third tool technique is Mousterian. So we went from Oldowan to, I always forget the names of these. Oldowan to Acheulean. Again, Oldowan to Acheulean. So Oldowan is Australopithecine. Acheulean is Homo erectus, pretty much. Early Homo, and this latter one is later Homo. Basically almost modern Homo, Mousterian. Really cool looking stone tools. And definitely the addle and stuff like that. They're using other wood to shoot spears and all sorts of complex fishing technology, fish hooks, or at least spears with prongs on it. So there's a lot more meat in their diet, these early archaic Homo, and thus anybody else is going to have a lot more access to protein. And again, hence, are their brains as complex as ours? Some of the brains, like of Neanderthal, our brain is smaller than Neanderthals, but our brain is probably more complex than Neanderthals, more connections. All right. And Neanderthal is buried their dead, so they definitely had symbolic culture. They thought about the afterlife, or they thought each other were important. There's one evidence of potential cannibalism, but it could also be scarification of a ritual thing. He was our leader. Let's kind of, put his head on a stick to celebrate or something. Did Neanderthals talk? Yeah, I think most people think they definitely had complex communication and language. There's genetic evidence for it. The FOXP2 gene is called, which is connected to them being able to produce speech, and their hyoid bone is very similar to ours, which is integral in vocalizations of things like vowels. Yow, that's all the vowels, which means I can produce over 1 million words with that vowel. All right, the early Homo sapiens, we can see where they've been around 200,000 years ago for sure. And then we see, other evidence of them around and around, until we get to, the first historic sort of things in terms of. So, yeah, the last thing I want to touch on is the 3 different kind of theories of how we got to where we are. The out of Africa model is one of them. The Um, uh, anyway, I'll just, I can't find the actual names of them, so I'm sorry. They're on this page, but most likely, Homo erectus evolved into modern Homo sapien, us 200,000 years ago. Um, and um, and most likely that was done in East Africa, and most likely then Homo sapiens, us, left East Africa and moved into Asia and Europe. Okay, we found predecessors there, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and a number of others, and we interbred with some of them. Okay, not to any huge event that then we're not Homo sapiens anymore. Basically, we're Homo sapiens with a few bits of Neanderthal genes in us, or Denisovan genes, but we're still Homo sapiens. So that kind of out of Africa model is the one that has most dominated the field right now in terms of how we got where we got. The other ones, that somehow Denisovans evolved into Asian people or something, Neanderthals evolved into Europeans. That's zero evidence, or very little evidence for it, and kind of dangerous because it sounds like different species somehow, that the Asians are different from Europeans, a whole different species with a co-evil, kind of like New World monkeys and Old World monkeys. And that's absurd, because, yeah. So, okay, well, that was the end of that. I think I pretty much covered everything. I'm glad to say. And all right, let me just